for the briefest of times when DVDs were king. One particularly neat feature were the cuts, where the directors and producers and some of the stars would talk over the movie about what happened in the making of it and what might have hit the cutting room floor. I generally didn't have the attention span to watch, but not really watch, an entire movie in this way. But it does reflect our general fascination about why something didn't work within the story of the movie. It is an opportunity to think about the stories we don't tell. The stories we don't tell. That's a long list. A week or so ago, I caught up with one of my cousins. We're the same age, childhood friends. And I'm not really good at small talk, like at all. And so the conversation got deep fast. Occupational hazard, I guess. So she happened to comment about a particular characteristic of many people in our family. And I made this kind of offhand comment, something like, well, you know why that is. But I discovered that she didn't know why that was. Because that is a story we don't tell in our family. These are often the stories that we dance around, but never really say, right? The conflict, the embarrassment, the abuse, the crime. And if we do tell these stories, we tend to tell them at a whisper. We tell them in as few words as possible because they're still the stories we'd rather not tell. The stories that we're convinced provide no real meaning to our lives. The stories we're sure that actually only rob us of life. These are the stories that are unsolvable, that are unredeemable. But the truth is, these are still stories that give us life, that give meaning to our lives. Today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures is so beautiful on its face. David, now the uncontested king of Israel, the one who vanquished the Philistines and established Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom, solidifies his reign by reuniting the ark with the people and bringing it all into Jerusalem. Leading the ark's procession, he sacrifices an insane and uncomfortable amount of animals. And this is the beautiful part. He dances with all his might. But when the wise consultation on common text, the group that created our 3-year cycle of texts for worship, when they selected this text to be a part of our summer series on David and his successors, when they selected this text, you might have noticed that they took a huge chunk out of the middle of it. And this story within the story we'd rather not tell, is about Uzzah. Uzzah, who was given the honor of driving the cart that carried the ark. But at some point in the journey, the way was not smooth, and the oxen shook the cart. And Uzzah, even though he was among the 30,000 chosen men of Israel, Uzzah was not consecrated. And Uzzah, untrained as a priest, did what priests trembled to do. Uzzah, with his heart in the right place and knowing how even the most sacred of objects can fall to the ground and shatter into a million pieces, Uzzah reached up his unconsecrated hand to steady the ark, the throne of God on earth. And according to the chunk of text that we were not given to read today, God struck him dead then and there. And David, the once shepherd boy, the songwriter, the loyal soldier, the faithful conqueror, the man after God's own heart, His faith is shaken to its core, and he stops what he is doing and does not deal with the ark for 3 whole long months. This is a story we rarely tell. We rarely tell it because we, like David, end up shaken to our core. What does this mean? What does this mean for our faith? Are we, as the Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards once intoned, merely sinners in the hands of an angry God? I thought about reading this story in worship this week. But then I worried I'd have to make sense of it. I would have preferred to chicken out and talk about Ephesians. That was a great text, wasn't it? Beautiful. Yet, leaving it out seems to stand as a stark reminder of all the stories we do not tell, and they are many. I thought of this as a good example. In the 1960s and 70s, when a group of Lutherans from several different denominations came together to create a common worship source, a book that would become that stalwart green Lutheran book of worship, and the blue Lutheran worship of Missouri Synod congregations. When they put that book together, they only included the Psalms that we would use in worship. The Psalms that come up in a 3-year lectionary cycle, which is mostly only the happy Psalms. They left out almost entirely the imprecatory Psalms, the Psalms that call down God's wrath on our enemies. After all, aren't those the stories we'd rather not tell? How do we make meaning out of our own victimhood? Where is our faith in that? And then, of course, this week, the news was filled with the stories we'd rather not tell. Stories about our country's racist past, racist present, racist policies. Stories about how race is actually of our own making, and that racism is a system that oppresses us all. In preparation for our vacation trip to the Great Smoky Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and to the land that belongs to the Cherokee Nation, in preparation for a trip which included a delightful and moving visit with Lisa Russell at our partner congregation, Living Waters Lutheran Church. To prepare for this trip, we tried to teach our children about the Trail of Tears. And one of my big-hearted kids asked in all earnestness, "Does that mean our country is bad?" These are the stories we do not want to tell. These are the stories we do not want to tell, beloved, because how will we ever find God in all this loss? But, beloved, that is precisely our call as the church. It is easy to see God in beautiful scenery and gorgeous sunsets and the generosity of strangers. It is easy to see God when you get a windfall of good luck. But the other times? Luther once wrote, a theology of glory calls evil good and good evil. A theology of the cross calls the thing what it actually is. We don't look at these stories of evil, of our worst choices as humanity, of unspeakable tragedy, and pretend that they can just be tied up with a neat bow. I don't know, really, what sense to make of God's actions against Uzzah. I do not know if I am right to pray for God's wrath on my enemies, and I do not know what that might say about my faith that is so rooted in forgiveness. I do not know where God was when for centuries men and women and children were uprooted from their homes, shipped across the ocean, and enslaved for generations in this country. I cannot make sense of manifest destiny, of Jim Crow, of redlining. I may not know where God is in all of that, but I stake my faith on this single truth: God is there. My theology professor, Dr. Monica Coleman, said every single class, theology is what you think about when you think about God. And thus we are all theologians. And about us, Luther said, a person deserves to be called a theologian who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. Translation? Everything we know about God points to the truth that if we want to look for God, we need look no further than the suffering of our neighbor. If we want to look for God, we need look no further than the stories we are too afraid to tell. We need look no further than the bottom of the rubble in Miami. We need look no further than the unrest in Haiti. We need look no further than the graves of 6 million and more dead by COVID. We need look no more further than the disappointments and frustrations of trying to be a faithful people in contentious times, of trying to bring about God's kingdom in a world hell-bent on its own destruction. And so where does this leave us, beloved? David finally picked up the ark because, having seen God's wrath, what came next was God's blessing. He heard a rumor that the home where he'd left the ark was being blessed. And so David brought the ark into Jerusalem and danced before it with all his might. And maybe that is what we are called to do, beloved. To dance with all our might between the stories we cannot wait to tell and the stories at least part of us would prefer to silence forever. To dance with all our might between sin and redemption, between evil and good, between death and life, and to trust that God is there in it all.